So today we are very happy to welcome Dr. Mike Orfanedes. He's a commercial horticulture agent in Broward County. He has 17 years experience, probably more now, as a ISA Certified Arborist, and I'm sure he's going to tell you what those letters mean. He's won numerous awards from very prestigious organizations for his tree education outreach programming. He is a long-term ISA exam proctor and is active member of the Florida Landscape Inspector Association. So Mike, we welcome you. We are so glad that you are here. And I am going to stop share so you can start sharing.
Thank you, Wendy. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
So it's in display and notes mode. So if you go up to where it says display settings,
Okay.
and click swap.
Is that better?
We'll give it a second.
Is that better?
Just a second, there's a little lag. So did you click swap?
Yep.
Okay, it'll follow suit here in a minute.
That was on the other screen. I've got two screens open, so maybe I need to do it on this screen.
I think it's frozen.
Really? Let me try this. Did that move?
It's still in notes mode.
Okay.
Display settings. Swap.
Mm-hmm.
How's that look?
I still see it in notes mode. How about you, Wendy?
It's still in notes mode for me.
How about now?
Yeah, let's try resharing it.
Yep, try to reshare. Yay!
That work?
Perfect.
Okay.
Take it away, Mike.
Thank you, guys. So the growing pains of distance education. Every time we do a class, something new happens or something new we learn. So anyway, I hope we're where we need to be, and we will move forward with a presentation I'm going to work through pretty quickly. I have quite a few slides here today, talking about a very important subject in terms of trying to maintain and grow a sustainable urban tree canopy in Florida, which is kind of hurricane central, really, aren't we? Although this year we've been so far so good, pretty lucky compared to other states like Louisiana, which had its 5th named storm yesterday, Zeta. So this slide just kind of shows that Florida is certainly no stranger to tropical storms and hurricanes. As you can see, it looks a bit like spaghetti on the wall. South Florida has the distinction of being the busiest or the epicenter, at least in terms of the state and having the storms cross us. So we do need to know a thing or two about preparedness, don't we? People ask, so what kinds of damage can we expect when hurricanes and tropical storms impact our tree canopy? And here are some examples, courtesy of Henry Mayer in Miami-Dade County, who's also a fellow ISA Certified Arborist. Sometimes our trees are uprooted, sometimes the trunks snap off. A lot of times the trees don't break off, but they're leaning, as we see here. Limb failure, of course, is extremely common, and no surprise on leaf loss. So of all of these situations, leaf loss is probably of the least concern because the trees will releaf with, depending upon the time of year, within a matter of weeks or months, and where you are in the state. If it's a late storm in the Panhandle, sometimes these trees won't really recover much until spring, but down in South Florida, within about a month to 6 weeks, we'll see a lot of canopy coming back. Of course, it does take years to recover the canopy. And so, trees get blamed for power outages and damage to property, and insurance companies are increasingly nervous about tree canopy on properties they insure. And that's a concern, of course, as we try to grow tree canopy and shade our homes and sequester carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are causing the planet to overheat. Trees provide so many benefits, but you know, they do need to be maintained, and we do need to use good common sense when we locate them in places that they will thrive and not where they will become a hazard. And so right tree, right place is front and center, I should say, in terms of a hurricane preparedness plan. But the damage to the property, of course, and then handling all the debris, which is extremely time consuming and expensive, is always an issue, isn't it? Some folks think that if you plant the right tree species, you won't have to worry about storm damage. And while there are definite differences in the tensile strength of wood, the species itself is not really, I would think, the looming factor to consider. It's the maintenance or lack thereof. You know, we know oak trees and certain other ones do have harder wood and probably fail a little less frequently than those that are brittle. And we've had some good experiences with that. But again, you know, even the best, strongest wood type of tree, if it's not maintained properly and it has defects in the canopy, is going to be subject to failure. We'll get into more of that a little bit later. So what kinds of factors impact whether there's going to be a lot of damage to the tree canopy or not? Of course, the storm's intensity is huge, isn't it? I mean, a tropical storm and a Cat 1 hurricane will generally not provide as much damage or create as much damage as a Cat 3 or stronger. That's kind of common sense. The duration of the storm is also slow moving, fast moving. Some of the pictures I was seeing from Zeta that came ashore near New Orleans yesterday afternoon, as a Cat 2, some of the scenes I was seeing were not nearly as bad as I might have expected from a Cat 2, but again, Zeta picked up speed and moved through very, very quickly. The tree's size, of course, its age and its health, including past abuses, we'll touch on that a little bit too, are significant. The trunk and the branching structure, the presence or absence of defects, which we can often correct with good pruning, and a lot of times that doesn't occur because consumers and homeowners and property managers are not aware of defects in the canopy. We'll spend a lot of time looking at that today. The quality of the root ball, the presence again or absence of defects, circling roots, trees that are planted in the ground that are pot bound tend to go over quite with good frequency. Whereas those that have a good quality root ball at Florida grade number 1 or better, we tend to get better results with. Soil factors, how compacted is the soil? Are the roots able to go down and really anchor the tree, or are they restricted by a hard pan or previously compacted construction site? Is there good drainage? You know, have you shut your irrigation system down in advance of the storm? The last thing you want to have is a saturated soil from irrigation right ahead of a hurricane. And you'd be surprised the number of people that don't think to shut their system off when, you know, we're days away from an impact. Placement in the landscape, of course, we've talked about that just a little bit already. We want to make sure that our trees are sited in good locations, not, you know, real close to buildings or near power lines and so forth. And then on palms, there's a lot that we have to learn about and teach people with regard to the hurricane cutting the palm really hard and removing most of the fronds prior to the storm is about the worst thing you could do. So Dr. Gilman, who's now retired, he was a professor of arboriculture in the Department of Environmental Horticulture at UF, is my mentor and taught so many of us so many great things, and you know, leaves a legacy with some very big shoes to fill. Created a wind machine up at UF. He had the Great Southern Tree Conference for years, and I was a faithful regular attendee at that event, sponsored in large part by industry. Built this wind machine that was capable of creating winds of up to 130 miles an hour. And then he blew these trees that they had with various pruning styles and so forth. And this slide is just showing simply that if you do prune the canopy in any way, there is going to be less displacement of the trunk and less likelihood of breakage. Of course, he did find that certain styles of pruning, certain methods, you know, had better results than others as well. We'll get into that. My big thing is about structural pruning, and that's something that we don't see enough of. We teach it continuously in our classes, tirelessly, trying to get tree canopy to mimic what it would be like in nature in a typical hammock or woods, depending on what part of the state you're in. Down here, we call a woods or a forest a hammock. Maybe in the north part of the state, the hammock isn't used quite as frequently. I don't know, but trees that have one single dominant trunk, I'm talking about large, medium, and large maturing trees, do tend to fare better in windstorms rather than those that have multiple trunks. And so we'll be talking a lot about that. And speaking of which, here are a couple shots of some trees that failed. This one over here in my homeowners association, just around the corner from my house in Weston, Florida. Back in 2005, Hurricane Wilma, a weak Cat 2, came right over the city of Weston. The eye was very visible at the peak of the storm. We looked up and saw blue sky, and then about 10-15 minutes later, the backside came through, and we all had to run back in our homes and shelter again. So lots of limb breakage, multiple trunks that split apart. Here's an oak tree. People say oak trees don't fail, and that's just not true. Multiple trunk trees with large, heavy limbs, codominant leaders, we call them, will fail in a heartbeat if the defect is severe enough. Proper pruning is just so important to preparing the tree canopy for storm management. And here are a couple of cuts that we use just in general tree pruning, preparedness and other. A removal cut, which removes a smaller limb back to a larger limb or back to a trunk. And a reduction cut, which is just the inverse, where we remove a larger upright limb back to a lower, smaller limb. That's called a reduction cut. So we'll get into when we use these cuts. And in general, if you are doing your own pruning or you're hiring it done, there are a few things to know about branch removal. Very simply, make a 3-step cut if you're removing a limb from a trunk, and leave the branch collar on the tree. The branch collar is the swelling right where the trunk meets the branch. There'll be a swelling. There's something called a branch bark ridge, which is a raised area of tissue on the trunk right above where the branch connects to the trunk. And this swelling, called the collar, we leave that on the tree. The first cut we would make if we're going to be removing a limb is an undercut, maybe 6 to 8 inches out from our final cut. Our second cut is called a top cut. When we make that cut farther out on the limb, the purpose of that cut is to drop the limb on the ground, and if it would tear back, it will break off at this point and not tear all the way down into trunk tissue. This is a great way to remove a limb that's larger than something that you can hold in your other hand when you're making that cut. In other words, if you didn't do that and you just made one cut, chances are by the time you got about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the limb would break off and you have the risk of it tearing into the trunk. We always want to protect the trunk tissue. We do not want to allow fungi and other decay organisms to get into the trunk. Now, if you're making a reduction cut, let's say we're shortening a codominant leader, or we're maybe going to reduce the overall height of the leader itself, then we make a cut like this. This cut is made where we bisect an angle created by something called stem bark ridge and an imaginary line perpendicular to the limb we're going to cut. Split the difference, and that's where you make the cut. So this would be not in the case of removing a lower limb up, limbing up the tree. This would be where you're actually reducing the canopy height, or you're trying to shorten one of those competing leaders. Now, here's a cut we do not make in the landscape for the most part. This is called an internodal stem cut or stub cut. This is what happens when people top trees. They just indiscriminately round them over, cut every upright limb they can, and don't pay any attention to where they make the cut. The problem with that is it will sprout out like crazy, and if it's a large enough internodal stem cut, it will decay. And the problem then is the sprouts that will form beneath the cut are growing attached to compromised wood. There's an example of a tree that was topped off. This is a ficus tree in South Florida. And you can see this was actually, I think this is here in Davie. Big diameter stem cuts, stub cuts, whatever you want to call them. And you can see that there's foliage coming out beneath the cuts, but what you're not seeing is the decay that's setting in and migrating down. So over time, these very dense sprouts will elongate, gain weight, and then they become subject to breakage because they're attached to compromised wood. So that's topping trees. We don't want to do that. That's against the code in many of our counties, including Broward. Our cities actually will write violation notices to homeowners that have this done to their trees, or tree services that are out there butchering the trees. These are not proper cuts. We want to try to avoid that. By the same token, flush cuts where we cut the collar right off of the tree and exposed trunk wood is not a good thing either. These are typically cuts made by unlicensed tree services. We call them weekend warriors, people that go out and just make some chump change on days when they don't think code enforcement officers will catch them. Some homeowners, of course, make flush cuts on trees. I have to admit, before I became an arborist years ago in college, we were taught to make flush cuts. And so that was many years ago, more years than I care to share with you, but just know that when you're exposing trunk wood like this, that's not a good thing. And the other thing, of course, we were taught was to spray paint these wounds with tree wound dressing, and that's been shown to be pretty ineffective as well. So don't be making large diameter cuts on trees, and make them at the branch collar, not flush with the trunk. Here are some examples in the aftermath of making stub cuts and flush cuts. A lot of decay, which compromises the tree's ability to survive in the next windstorm. Here are some examples of topped off trees. You can see they're starting to sprout out. They typically don't die, but again, they get a lot of decay in those large diameter cuts. And of course, then we get a windstorm and we get a lot of breakage. That's mild. I mean, some of these trees fail after the limbs get quite weighty and sizable. You can reduce the height of a canopy if the tree has gotten too large for the location that it was put in. And you know, without topping the tree, you can reduce the height of the canopy. That's called the canopy reduction. These mahogany trees in an arterial median in Weston were reduced. The height was reduced recently. Here we see some black olives. They don't even look pruned. But we use these reduction cuts, okay, where we're coming back, we're removing an upright limb back to a lower limb. Again, that goes back to this cut that I showed you here and down here, reduction cut, cutting the mama back to the baby. It's a good way to reduce the overall height of a tree, or as this slide shows, removing upright limbs that are competing with our dominant leader. Okay, is everybody with me on that? Okay, so that's canopy reduction. That is a great, safe, legal alternative to topping trees. And I get it, you know, sometimes we buy properties and the trees were planted and they're really not, there's not enough space for them, and short of removing them, which is one option, and starting over, moving the replacement tree farther away from the house, farther away from the power lines, we can get them to do a canopy reduction. And just to kind of compare the differences between a proper reduction and an improper reduction or topping. With a proper reduction, we reduce the size while maintaining the form, as opposed to a topping situation where we're actually drastically changing the appearance of the tree, right? We get minimal regrowth in the terms of sprouting with a proper reduction. There will be some, but not as much as you get with topping the tree. Cuts are barely noticeable versus cuts is very noticeable, and you get a lot more decay. So again, kind of thinking about that, And looking at these trees here, which were improperly pruned, topped off, hat racked, whatever you want to call it, versus a proper canopy reduction. Big difference, isn't there? So that's why it's so important if you're going to hire a tree service to hire somebody who is licensed and trained. And in Broward County, the extension service here, we train people that are going to be pruning trees for hire that are going to be doing that work in the county, regardless of where the tree service is located. We're one of the few counties that has such a program. And I think it has improved the overall quality of the trimming. So know that reduction of, the reduction of type pruning is certainly suited better to some species than others. We do know there are differences in the ability of some species to tolerate decay because they can compartmentalize it. Some species that would not be good candidates would be such things as ficus, poinciana, red maple, Hong Kong orchid. Some of those are only South Florida trees, I realize, but laurel oak is another one, doesn't really respond well to heavy pruning cuts. Those we'd probably want to go lighter on. Live oak, on the other hand, mahogany, Gumbo, Limbo, Magnolia, they probably tend to be a little more able to tolerate somewhat larger cuts. So I want to move on and talk about some other forms of tree abuse that certain tree services perform regularly that put our trees at risk of failure. And this is a real common one here. Is there a question?
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
And I know this is one of your favorite topics, so I hate to interrupt you, but Inger, who we all know and love, has asked about removing those sprouts that come off.
We're going to get to that, Inger.
Okay.
Yep, we'll be getting to it. So
okay, thank you.
Yep, well, we'll talk about that when we get there. So this is a real common form of tree abuse across the state. I see it in Gainesville as frequently as I see it in South Florida. Overlifting, and I want you guys to realize that the presence of interior canopy in the middle part of the tree in particular, obviously we have to limb them up enough to get clearance and passage for, passersby and vehicles and whatnot. But when you denude the tree's canopy this far up, you predispose the limbs to breakage, as you see over here on this black olive. This is in Sunrise, Florida, right after Hurricane Irma in 2017. The presence of canopy, foliage, sprouts, limbs in the middle part of the tree in particular, interior canopy helps develop taper, girth and taper in these limbs, which you don't see very much of as we're looking at these. So, tree limbs are like a fishing pole. Think about a fishing pole. How is it shaped? At the grip end where the reel is, it's wider than it certainly is out at the tip. And that taper imparts strength. So, for the fisherman or fisher person who's got a good fight on the other end of the line, there's going to be a lot of flexing and bending on that fishing pole. The same with a tree limb in a windstorm. It's going to be battered back and forth, maybe for hours. And if it does not have good taper because it's been basically robbed of its inner canopy, the tree is going to end up having a lot of breakage, as we see here. And we'll talk about restoring these trees as we get toward the end of the show. And all of the canopies up top. Now, we have something called an ANSI standard, American National Standards Institute, which guideline says a BMP, half of the foliage should remain in the lower 2/3 of the tree. I think about 100% or 95% of the foliage is in the top third here. So only half the foliage should be in the top third. The other half of the foliage should be farther down below. So these trees are clearly overlifted and at risk for breakage. What they've essentially done, the other thing is this causes forced elongation on the end, and you get an elongated lever arm. We talk about the lever arm quite a bit when we talk about arboriculture and proper pruning. We want to maintain that as short as possible without encouraging it to be overextended. So here's an example of a tree in my HOA that has been properly pruned. And I think if you look at this mahogany tree, you would probably tend to agree that about half the foliage is in the lower 2/3. So this tree is in compliance. These are not. Okay? Probably the most common form of tree abuse in Broward County today, because we have pretty much eliminated popping. Now, getting back to that oak tree, again, people saying, well, Mike, come on, oak trees are tough. They're, they've been around for hundreds of years. They don't fail in storms. They do. And what happens when we let a branch or a limb like this get too big and too heavy relative to the trunk it's attached to, we can get a crack forming. And so this tree, unless it's cabled, is probably going to have to be removed. And that's a shame, all because this limb was allowed to get too large. In general, no limb on a tree should be larger than half to 2/3 the diameter of the trunk where it's attached, at that point at which it's attached, okay? So I want to get into how do you maintain good form in trees. And so this is going to be some review for some of you, and for others, maybe it's new, but we call it structural pruning, a process of shortening or removing one or more codominant leaders. So when I go back to this limb, that's what this is. This is really more of another trunk, or we call it a codominant. It's competing with the leader, and it's gotten too big, and now it's starting to fail. So we want to manage size so this does not happen. So we do that by shortening or removing one or more codominant limbs, by pruning the terminal, typically upright or end portion of the limb to slow its growth rate. So other portions of the tree, like the leader that we want to develop, will grow faster. Okay? And this will not be a process that will turn a tree around overnight. If the tree is large and has been let go for a number of years, it can take 4 or more years to get it into some semblance of normalcy. Here are some examples of codominance, okay? And we have another term called a bark inclusion. When bark is trapped between 2 or more upright limbs, codominant leaders, we get these bark inclusions. Those are pressure points, pinch points. And that's where the breakage occurs. You can see there was a breakage here. There was a 4th codominant on this Hong Kong orchid. How many codominant leaders do you think are in this Gumbo Limbo? Count them up, guys. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the inclusions are here. They're these seams where these limbs are pressed up against each other with no room to grow. Remember, the tree branch will not only elongate, it also will expand in size radially. It'll become fatter, girthier. This poor leader in the middle has no room to grow. And we actually find these trees can sometimes begin to self-wound because they just have nowhere to go. Imagine being in an elevator that's got too many people on it. How many times have we been in those kinds of situations? It's a little uncomfortable, right? Well, imagine if that was life. You never had nobody getting off, and everybody was getting bigger. That's kind of the analogy here. So this is problematic, and that's why we need to pay attention to it, because these limbs will break out, fall down, and if there are targets underneath them, we can get some hazardous conditions developing. Some bad things can happen. So here's a picture of a shady lady black olive in my HOA's playground pot lot. Right there, we have a target, and we have now half a tree because of this inclusion, this bark pinched inside that crotch. And this tree had to be removed and replaced. Here is a cross section showing 2 codominant leaders. This is a small one, but still it's got an inclusion. There's bark pinched inside that crotch. And so these are the kinds of things we want to try to minimize and address in a good preventative pruning program. I don't want to spend a lot more time on this because time is limited, but here again, I hope now you can identify that that's one of those inclusions, one of those pinch points. There's another one in an oak tree. This is a CVS store on Griffin and Flamingo. If you're familiar with Broward, out in Southwest Ranches, we have half an oak tree. Now, I'm not suggesting every single codominant leader on a property needs to be addressed. I mean, in an ideal world, yes, but at least let's try to manage the condition in those areas where, should the tree fail, bad things might happen. Places where there are targets, nearby targets, buildings, playgrounds, parking lots. bus shelters, the list goes on and on. And here's another example. So we say when it comes to trees and their trunks, and again, I'm not talking about ligustrum and crepe myrtles and small maturing trees. I'm talking about the big trees. We say it's better to be single. It's supposed to be a joke, but it's true. This tree actually failed in January of last year. I don't know, there was no tropical weather anywhere near it. It just, gravity never takes a break. And this inclusion and this heavy limb at one point just failed. So, how do we manage this then in all practicality? Well, this is a Gumbo Limbo tree in my HOA that has got a nice single dominant trunk. It's got well-spaced scaffold branches. There's a cut there, a reduction cut to kind of keep this a branch and not make it competitive with the leader. In the woods, the trees don't develop codominancy to the extent that they do in the landscape because of shading and competition. There's not a lot of resources to invest in growing all these multiple codominant leads. And it's the same in South Florida. This shot was actually taken in Southwest Georgia last fall, but it's a hammock, it's a forest situation, just like we'd have anywhere in the state. And our nurseries, of course, have become very proficient at growing nice, good single leader trees. The problem is we put them in the landscape and then we ignore them, and they begin to get these heavy codominant kinds of defects. So I hope you're all with me and kind of getting this. Dr. Gilman on his website, which I'll share with you a little later, has a wonderful diagram and a lot of information about the process of how to address this condition in trees. And these are young trees here, but look at this model here. We've got a leader A, a leader B, and a leader C. C and A are competing with B. B is our dominant leader, the one we want to develop. So the way to correct that condition is to come in with reduction cuts on A and C. And you can see here, what's dotted is the upright limbs they've removed with reduction cuts, cutting the mama back to the baby. And this is actually a little more aggressive approach, same thing, but you're getting your results a little faster. And that's how you maintain good form, using that reduction cut, making a cut just above the junction where a smaller limb meets the larger limb you're cutting. Okay, we like to keep this at about a third the diameter of no less than a third the diameter of the main limb you're cutting. So here's an example of a mahogany before. It's a typical slingshot tree. Here's the leader. I chose this to be the leader because it's the best position relative to the other part of the tree, the codominant lead, and we make one cut, one reduction cut. You can see my cut over here, and I forever change the outcome of this tree with one cut. That's because it's a small tree. If it's a larger tree, well, then we have a little more work to do. This is a black olive in Plantation, Florida, nearby town. Here's our leader. This is actually a codominant. We've made a cut up here. That's this cut here. Next year, we'll come in and we'll come down and maybe make a cut here or possibly down here. Stair-stepping the codominant leader down year by year until we get to a point where it's essentially no longer, or it's no longer a threat to the dominance of the leader. Here's another example of a reduction cut. This is Jonathan Frank with Bartlett Tree Experts. He's one of my arborist instructors. This guy's a board certified master arborist, making that reduction cut, cutting this upright codominant limb back to a lower lateral limb. Again, next year, we'll probably make a cut here, ultimately making a cut here and transforming this into a limb, a branch that doesn't compete with our leader. So I don't want to spend a lot of time. We're running out of time here, but if I had this tree to work with, again, perfect example, I would choose this part of the tree to develop, and this less desirable portion, this codominant, I would make several strong cuts in to kind of rein it in and eventually make another cut. And at some point, we might actually completely remove it. This is a picture of the tree work in my homeowners association. We had a terrible ordeal with Hurricane Wilma, lost 37% of our street trees, and the ones that remained, we had to replace the ones we took out, but the ones that we we ended up trying to do canopy removal and restoration on them with reduction cuts. As you can see here, trying to remove and reduce codominant weeds. This oak tree, when we started, had no discernible leader in it at all. It took 10 years to get it into some semblance of good structure, and we're almost there, not quite yet, but it's got a beautiful leader at this point. So here's the final outcome. We make the final removal cut on the codom at a time when we have about a 3-to-1 ratio. Okay, the leader is 3 times the diameter of the codom we've been subordinating now for a number of years. This tree over on this side, we're not at that point yet. It's going to be another few years before we can make a final cut. And when we do, we're going to try to get rid of as much of that included bark as we can. So the tree in front of my house, just to kind of show you how I transformed it from 2001 when I first learned about codominancy as a novice arborist and attended Dr. Gilman's pruning session. I worked on that tree, and in 3 years, I had it down to 2 codominants. I chose this one to be my lead, and I got rid of these 2 by 2004. 3 years later, I'd already removed 2 of the 4. Look how small the remaining codominant is. And by 2007, I had me my single leader mahogany tree. So I like to end that discussion with this, showing this as an end result versus the unpruned low bid plaza tree behind my house, and ask you which of these 2 do you think will survive the next storm. Hopefully you'll choose the one on the right. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. And this is a picture of the damage after the storm in my HOA. Prior, we had done no pruning of the street trees with terrible results. You know, you pay now, you pay later. And then the board went on a remedial pruning program, including the new trees we installed. And this was the damage we had in Hurricane Irma, which would have been 12 years later. In this case, we had massive cleanup, $1,000 per house assessment per household. In Irma, which was a comparable storm, longer in duration, maybe a little less intense, but nevertheless minimal damage, no special assessment. And without spending any time, because I don't have it to go over the numbers, comparing it, we were able to save about $122,000 in 380 trees by putting the investment into the pruning of our street trees that we had, were able to invest in over that 10 to 12 year period. So now I want to move a little bit on to the palms. Palm trees that have most of their fronds removed are at higher risk of failure in storms because the growing point is at the base of the head. And when we take too much foliage off, we expose that bud to the forces of the wind. The codes for the American National Standards Institute and what we follow in Broward County is do not remove green live fronds above the horizontal, essentially a position equal to 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. If it's a green frond at that point or higher, it should stay on the tree. That's better for the tree, helps the tree become more storm resilient. Of course, the fronds feed the tree, and so over pruning, of course, can damage them. We can get narrow necking and penciling, breakage, and of course, distortion of the growing point at the base of the head when we do the hurricane cut. So the last few slides I've got to show you are on removal versus remediate. And so I just have some slides here to share with you. In a case like this, if a tree is this far gone, the lead is shot, most of the codominants or limbs are gone, we have to remove it, okay? That's pretty much a no-brainer. This is going to decay, become highly hazardous. We just don't want it. Similarly, a big crack that's formed in the crotch of the tree, I would be very hesitant to want to allow that tree to remain. Sometimes we can cable and brace them, but that hardware will eventually, it's not a permanent fix. So a vertical crack in the trunk is, like I showed you with that oak, is kind of a no-no. So that tree probably should also be removed. Large trees that have gone over, Dr. Gilman used to say if it's greater than about 6 inches in diameter, we really don't recommend resetting them because too many of the anchor roots have been fractured or split, and the probability of decay and roots greater than 2 inches is pretty high. Many cities, though, will restand these trees, and as you can see here, it was done with these ficus trees in Weston, and they put these supports on them. The big issue is, when will the tree be stable on its own that these can be removed? And no arborist I know of can tell you a definite answer, provide you a definite answer. So that's kind of why we don't recommend resetting large trees, because of the potential for snap, split, cracked roots to decay. There's a lot of weight to hold up, and we just probably don't want to go there. Here again, this tree, this is a black olive, a lot of damage to the canopy. You know, it's not going to die, but it's going to sprout out like crazy and take years to restore. So there again, that would be one I would probably, you know, and especially given where it's planted too close to the curb, we'd probably be better off with a new tree. Now, other situations where removal may be the best option if the tree is leaning toward a target. The remaining tree structure is highly susceptible to breakage, maybe because it was overlifted in the past, or the tree is a nuisance tree, or it's in poor health. Of course, your local codes are something you need to consider whenever you're talking about removing a tree. Now, remediate it, absolutely, whenever possible. You have a broken limb up top, make a nice clean cut and go on with life. Make proper cuts, especially if the tree was in good shape prior to the storm. You haven't gotten, you don't have a lean in it, you don't have a lot of damage at the base. Probably a pretty good candidate. We actually remediated this tree at our extension office. We made a cut down here below the break. This limb became kind of the new terminal. And, you know, it isn't as pretty as it was before, but there's no reason to remove an otherwise healthy tree. Similarly, this black olive had a big break up here, a lot of sprouting going on. We're going to manage those sprouts over the next few years. But, you know, I don't think enough damage was done to warrant removal, certainly. We would have to do some pruning over here to balance the tree, although while we try to develop this side of it to bring it back. Granted, it's codominant. That's a defect that was ignored and not corrected many years ago, and probably would be tough to straighten out at this point. This was a shaving brush tree it was a beautiful tree, and it ended up being removed some years later because of construction. It had nothing to do with the hurricane. I did take some sprouts off of this and have basically developed them into some other trees on our campus. So part of this tree has lived on. But look at the difference in 8 months. This is 8 months after this picture was taken. This is right after, 2 weeks after the storm. This is 8 months. So what do we do at that point? We go in and we start to think about thinning out some of those sprouts. We'll probably reduce a third of them, remove a third of them, and allow a third of them to remain. That's kind of what you do when you restore an lion's tail tree, an over prune tree. Select the sprouts that are growing most desirable, in the most desirable location, preferably the same direction that the limb was before it broke. The ones that tend to be going vertical and upright, those are the ones you want to remove and or shorten. So remove a third, shorten a third, allow a third to remain. That's pretty much what Dr. Gilman recommended. Okay, I'm just about out of time. I'm going to skip over the compartmentalization. We did talk about that a little bit already. Let's get into just a little bit more on cleanup. We want to remove any limbs that are broken or split, cracked, compromised in any way shortly after the storm. The sooner the better, because these could potentially be problematic and present a hazard. We use reduction cuts if they're upright limbs that are broken. Then we wait sometimes as much as 1.5 years for the sprouts to come. Don't be in a hurry to manage these sprouts. You have to let this tree kind of recover. And so it's putting a lot of sprouts out to kind of feed itself. And then we get into the sprout selection. We're going to remove some of these uprights. That's what the dotted lines show. We're going to reduce the others. And one of them we're going to allow to remain intact as our replacement limb for that particular branch. So these are the ones we're removing. And that's kind of what we end up with. And if this was a leader, let's say the main central leader, we would choose the most upright. If it's a branch, we would choose the ones that are more horizontal. Okay. I just want to make a few mention on palms, and then we'll take some questions. On palms, don't be in a rush to take a palm out if it has green foliage on it. A lot of times you'd be surprised at how these will recover, but it's going to take some time, up to maybe 2 years. And there'll be tree services knocking on your door saying, "Oh, you need to take it out. You need to take it out." I would want to wait. Even the limbs, the fronds that are maybe compromised but still green, the recommendation is leave those on the tree. Remember, they're feeding that palm, even though they're compromised. If they're green and they're still attached, they can provide some benefit to this otherwise very stressed tree. Royal palms, these are the ones from in front of my community after Wilma back in 2005. Within about 3 to 4 weeks, these palms that ended up looking like cigars began to put out new foliage. And so I say wait about 6 months. Give a palm at least 6 months, you know, especially in a late fall hurricane. It's not going to do a lot, especially in North Florida, probably till spring. But don't be in a rush to take them down, because you never know. Here are some examples of some palms. This one I would allow to remain. I would even hope that this one might recover. This one down here, I think probably the bud is broken. It's probably shot. But again, don't be in a hurry to cut these down. They may come back. Okay. So leave any green fronds on the palm. That's the take-home message on that. Obviously, if the limb or the trunk is cracked, like this Washingtonia, it is toast, and that definitely needs to go. All right. And then I sometimes get questions about, should we fertilize these trees extra? No, if anything, just water them, especially if it's a late storm. We're going into the dry season. Any of these trees you reset, you know, should be treated as newly planted. Don't worry about extra fertilizer. They're not really going to be able to use it. You know, fertilize them in the spring. But just don't over prune them. This palm is so over pruned, it's terrible. It really is. Remember, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock. If it's green, leave it on the palm. Okay, I'm just about done. These are some examples of palms that perform well in storms, but again, no palm is bulletproof. But we do tend to see these tended to perform better or had better recovery than some of the other ones. And on the hardwoods, Gumbo, Limbo, Magnolia, if you're in North or Central Florida, not well adapted to South Florida. Cypress did extremely well. Think about their architecture. Strong dominant trunk, many small diameter branches. That's why they do so well here. You know, they evolved in hurricane country. Oaks tended to do better than a lot of the other ones. Black ironwood is a South Florida tree with very, very dense wood. So, and then these are some small trees that have performed reasonably well too. But again, I don't want you to leave this class thinking, oh, it's all about the species, because it's not. It's the species, but it's also the maintenance and the management of defects. Okay. So in conclusion, just know that management of tree canopy is improving as we train our workforce and the public or the consumer to want to purchase and follow better tree care practices. Other pruning references, Dr. Gilman's 3rd edition is an awesome book. It's available on Amazon. You can also order it from the International Society of Arboriculture or probably the Tree Care Industry Association. Here's the ANSI standard that we follow. There's also a great publication on our EDIS system, Wind and Trees, Lessons Learned from Hurricanes. I recommend all of this, and Dr. Gilman's website is wonderful. Spend some time there if you're interested in improving the care of trees on your property. It's so great. We've been able to keep this website going even 3 years out from Dr. Gilman's retirement. Or just Google Ed Gilman landscape plants and you'll get there. So at this point, I want to conclude and ask if there are any questions.
There are a few questions. Great job, Mike. It was, it's kind of, sometimes it just hurts your heart to see that damage, you know, it's just like, oh, that poor tree, it lasted so long and then got taken out. So did we get to Inger's question about the sprouts being removed? You did, didn't you?
Yeah, again, as I said, you know, wait some time for the tree to get back on its feet, and then use the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 rule. Remove
Okay.
a third, reduce a third, allow a third to remain, taking into account the position, the direction of the sprouts growing as much as possible. Keep those that are growing in the same direction as the limb was prior to the storm.
Right. And then Peter said, isn't codominance normal in live oaks? And I, a lot of times when I was out doing a site visit and seeing a live oak with multiple stems, to me, that's when this is not for the faint-hearted. That's when you call the ISA professional, and then you see their work and you're like, oh, that's what we're talking about here. So could you talk about kind of helping that live oak to be its best?
Sure. Again, when we're growing trees in a non-native, non-natural environment, such as if you look at the picture here, you can see there's codominancy in at least 2 or 3 of the oaks in the picture. Broad spreading limbs with tight crotches, unions where there are pressure points, are prone to damage. We know that, we've discussed that. If the codominancy occurs and the angle of attachment is wide enough such that there's no inclusion, no pinch point, then the trees, it's a stronger union. Is it ideal? Maybe, maybe not. I would say to you that this homeowners association, it's here in Davie, they've done a wonderful job with the trees. These are original remnant trees that have been there. This is the old Pine Island Ridge. Goes back to the days of the Seminoles. They have grown and evolved, but not really in a typical hammock situation, because the land around them was developed. So yes, they are codominant. I would be surprised if there are any inclusions here, and so that is why they are kind of broad spreading. So it's both the codominance and also the inclusions that you need to be aware of. But a lot of codominant conditions lead to inclusions given enough time. So I wouldn't try to re-engineer the architecture of these historical oaks at this point. They're granddaddies and grandmas, granddaddies, whatever you want to call them.
They're grandfathered in, I'm going to
You know
say.
what they are. But I would suggest to you, if there are inclusions here, this tree probably will outperform the ones over here. Okay.
Okay.
And I don't know whether it had pruning and these didn't, or what the background is, but it's a great question. And again, think about targets. If you've got codominancy and you've got a major target underneath it, a parking lot, like I said, some of those examples, or a building, or even an ingress egress as you have here, I would pay more attention investing in pruning on these trees than I would on the ones farther down the buffer where maybe people don't typically go.
Okay. I've got a quick question that you can answer while you're going back to your somebody would like to see the cost analysis that you did, your comparison slide. So if you could go back to there, and while you're looking at, and I know you can multitask, Mike, somebody said, what happens when the sprouts come out from the bottom of a tree? How should you trim those?
Okay, basal suckers often form in response to stress in the canopy. We see that, a lot of oak trees will do that just because they do it. And I'm looking out my window at a Spanish stopper that's got a lot of sprouts at the base. I have no qualms about removing those, just normal maintenance kind of schedule. They're not really contributing a whole lot to the actual tree. Sometimes we see an abundance of sprouts when the top is dried out or died back, a few weeks or months after installation. You'll get a lot of that. But I'm not really too concerned about over pruning basal suckers.
Okay, and then her specific question is, should they be flush with the ground?
Yeah, I would make them, I actually removed a bunch of them yesterday.
Okay.
Out in their Simpson stoppers, and they just threw a lot of little sprouts. They were kind of unsightly. They're not going to cause a problem really, but we just kind of wanted to.
Yeah, it's aesthetics. And then another quick question before we look at this one is, Laura has a Barbados cherry, and she's thinking about doing reduction pruning to attain a single leader. And I know what I think about that, but what about you, Mike?
Well, are we talking about for the fruit or for growing it as more of a canopy tree? They don't get real big as I'm not real familiar with
Yeah.
them getting really big.
My thought is their nature is to be more of a vase shape, and the more branches, the more fruit. And so I would manage it for that.
You know, I guess I want to say this, and I didn't mention it, but all of the things I taught you guys about canopy trees are not really all that relevant to fruit trees, because actually, if we had Jeff Wasilewski here, who's my counterpart from Miami-Dade and does fruit extension, he would he would tell you my fruit trees look like an arborist pruned them, because an arborist did prune them. And I need to basically reduce the leader on some of those trees out there, because again, what's the point of you know, getting fruit 12 and 15 feet above ground? You want to keep a fruit tree pruned so that, yeah, it's broad spreading and it's not going to get super tall, because the goal is fruit production. So it's a totally different kind of situation.
Yeah.
Uh,
And before we get to the cost, Carol Ann wants to know, after a tree falls down, we get all those sprouts that come up. How do you manage those?
Well, if the tree fell down and you have observed that there's been major damage to anchor roots, the main large roots of the tree, either they're out of the ground, they're split, they're broken, you know, that would be a removal kind of situation. And sometimes even after removal, you get a lot of suckering from the stored sugars that literally that are in the roots that are left in the ground. So, you know, I would just mow them off, cut them back, you know, eventually they're gonna just quit. Now, there have been some situations, we have a yellow tab, for example, next door at the Research and Education Center, where the yellow tab was gone. I mean, it broke off and sprouts formed at the base of the stump that the farm crew cut a nice little stump there, left that. And one of those sprouts has turned into now it's a 10 to 12 foot cababuya tree. It's grown super fast since Irma 3 years later. We have another tree out there. So, you know, that's okay too. You know, if you like the tree and you want to put the energy into kind of developing it, you know, it will probably be fine. If it's in your front yard or in a, you know, highly public place, or a place where maybe, you know, you might be concerned about safety issues, I'd be a little less inclined to maybe want to do that, but it'll grow.
Okay, so I do want to get to this question from Bonnie Torres.
Okay.
I think she's finding that the $600 for tree removal just a super fair price. She's wondering if that's for a small tree. She's been quoted up to $5,000 for a removal. And if you could just take a couple minutes to answer that, Mike, and then somebody else's, where do you find a list of qualified arborists in Lake County? But I'll let you answer
Sure.
that about that. Okay.
Tree services are going to vary considerably in their prices that they charge. I always think it's good to get 3 bids. You know, that's kind of good common sense. There may be all over the place. A lot of it depends on whether you're getting a bulk rate or not. If you're an individual homeowner and a tree service is coming in to remove a tree, a single tree, or maybe 2 trees on your property, and they're going to be, you know, renting equipment or bringing it in from some distance to do one household, for example, your price is going to be significantly higher. This was a bulk rate. I mean, we had 400 trees that had to come out. And, you know, I tried to share with you the numbers that my HOA actually was looking at, as opposed to, yeah, I mean, to take out a tree, these trees were probably anywhere from 12 to maybe 18 inches in diameter, the diameter breast height. And so a single tree like that maybe we were able to get out for 600 might be as much as $900 or $1,200 if it's a single family type one, you know, situation. Sometimes we get, in the case of my HOA, after the pruning contract, for example, they finished those trees, they will do lot trees for individual homeowners at a slightly reduced rate because they're already there. They're already in the community. They've got their equipment there. Also, right before storm season or right after a storm, prices tend to be higher because there's tremendous demand. You know, they don't have enough manpower to get all the work done. They don't want to take on more work. They want to get as much as they can. You know, it's the marketplace. We tended to prune our trees in January because tree services are notoriously slow right then. Everybody spent their money at the holidays. They're not thinking about the trees. It's months away from hurricane season. You can get a lot better rates. And I think you can get better work because I would rather be pruning in 70-degree weather than 90-degree weather in June.
Right. Well, that's a good tip for January. And then Diana, as well as Jamie Doherty, drop treesaregood.org. Find an arborist in the chat box. So if you're looking for that ISA certified arborist and you want to make sure that that guy is on staff or that woman is on staff and they are, that's who you want to deal with. We don't want the fly by night guys.
I also want to mention on the replacement cost, we replaced the mahoganies with live oaks. Again, you could argue, you know, well, you're dealing with a 6-foot wide swale. Why would you put an oak tree in there? Well, first of all, the city would not allow us to put palms in. We really didn't want palms anyway because we didn't think palms and 20-year-old mahogany trees would really work aesthetically. I mean, we're trying to rebuild our canopy. The palms don't produce a lot of canopy. That's why most cities say if you're replacing a hardwood, you've got to give us another hardwood. If you're replacing a palm, you can put in a palm or a hardwood. You know, it all depends on what municipality you're in, what county you're in. But, you know, here in Broward, if it's a hardwood coming out, a hardwood's going back in. And the replacement cost back in the day, this was 2006, I want to say, because Wilma was in 2005. Things were cheaper. And, you know, this $300 tree today would probably be closer to $425. And pre-COVID, of course, we were in a big boom. So maybe prices have dropped somewhat now because of demand, but the nurseries have been pretty busy really all this year. You'd be surprised. So, you know, some of it's inflation, some of it's shopping around. A lot of it is the quality. If you're trying to get a new tree, I tell you, insist on a Florida grade #1 tree. If you're getting it from a reputable nursery, I think you're going to be money ahead. And, you know, beware of trees with circling roots, pot bound, been in the container too long, because that is a really tough defect to correct.
All right, Mike, we are right at 2:05 and I'm going to honor everyone's time as well as yours. Everyone remember that this recorded version will be posted on the Master Gardener website along with the PDF of Mike's presentation, if we have his permission. And Mike, we would like to thank you so much for speaking to the Master Gardener webinar today. We were over 130 people for you today. So we're really glad that you were able to get the word out to so many. So thank you so much. All right, we'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Okay. Bye.